The essay does allow us to ask questions, and the questions for me were, what sort of country do we live in, and what does reconciliation really mean in the early 21st century? And I guess they're some of the sort of broader questions you can stretch out in and examine in this form. The thing about the essay for a writer of books is that you get to finish it, and that 5,000 or 10,000 words is, you can luxuriate, but you can also see the finish line, which is when you're swimming and you can sort of see the shore, then that's a great thing. And for me, I've now, my essay is a book, so I didn't actually get to finish quite on schedule, but that's one of the things I guess the essay in theory allows for.
Thank you, Chloe. I'd like to, I suppose, pick up on just a few things that each of you have said. Nicolas, you talked about Montaigne. I have a collection of his essays at home, and I dip into it quite regularly, and the thing that always astonishes me is it's sort of unimprovable. You know, I mean, did he write them in 1520 or 70s? Certainly many hundreds of years ago, and they're just unimprovable, this form. And yet, you know, as Chloe said, in Australia, it's not a form we have a tradition of. It seems to me here that it's the column, the sort of 900-word column, or the book. And it's hard to, in our universities here too, I think that students are taught very much that there's just only one way to write an essay. It's not really an exploration. You know, they're told an essay, you know, it'll have an introduction, it'll say what you're going to do, and then you should, you know, argue the three most important points, and then you should say what you've done. And as somebody who came from universities, I mean, you just get this repeated form again and again and again, alongside perhaps a culture where reading essays and books is not as practiced as perhaps it once was. So I wonder, I suppose, if there's a sort of Gideon, you spoke a bit about the pleasure of that length. Nicolas, you write for a newspaper and you write books. Do you what's particularly enjoyable about the essay form? You know, for somebody that works in, as you do, in newspapers and the book form? Or all of you actually, but I'll start with Nicolas because he does both.
Each child of writing is beautiful, and you can have, although it's rare, a beautiful 800-word column. You can have a perfect think piece. You can have a perfect crime report. Happens very rarely. And obviously you can't have a perfect novel, but you can have very beautiful novels which are perfectly fitted to their length. And there's a different way of thinking, a different pace and style, which accommodates itself to lengths which seem to be like, you know, numbers in a mathematical sequence or distances in athletics. You know, there is a sort of 5,000 word mark, 7,000 word mark. Do you reckon those are about the distances and further out? And I thought what Gideon said was, you know, fantastically precise and beautiful when he was talking about the quiddity and the strangeness, where the point where the stereotypes fall away and you suddenly realize that you're actually writing about, wow, real experience, as opposed to what, you know, is handed down from story to story to story, or writing about the way things seem to you. And look, this whole question of form and, you know, nationality and what happens, I'm not sure we should be kind of really thinking too much about being in some sort of desperate ghetto on the wrong side of the world where essays don't happen because our education system has been messed up or historical antecedents aren't quite there. I think, you know, one of the sort of burdens and joys of being here is that sense that the evidence comes in from everywhere. I must say, I have to tell you, I find this sort of the form of the essay, or the rolling, the constant, the unclosed form fits very beautifully with my sense of the landscape that I move through, and it is precisely the closed and the socialized narrative that the longer I spend in the bush comes to feel like a bad fit. So I'm not sure that we're naturally non-essayistic human beings here, but maybe.
Well, I like the essay form from a journalist perspective, because you've got the dual, or the dual challenges of writing both at length but also writing economically. It's sort of where the rubber hits the road as far as journalism is concerned. Even though I've said before that I am perennially long-winded, I'm also extremely economical, and that's because I've had a journalist's training in the sense that space has always been a consideration for me. Word limits and deadlines have kind of become part of my metabolism. I almost can't think without a sense of finitude, both temporally and spatially. And when you're operating in an essay environment, those challenges are somehow more electrifying for a writer. Somehow in an 800-word piece, you never really get out of the starting blocks. But if you're operating sort of beyond 5,000 words, but you know that you're only allowed to write 6.5, the pressures to contour the piece to accommodate the enormous body of information that you will have inevitably have accumulated is extremely exciting, and it's actually hard once you've had that experience to go back to writing sort of cruder and more primitive forms.
Sort of down the line. I agree with you, Gideon, that there is something exciting about having to contour a piece, and that it gives you discipline as a storyteller as well. That you really have to find what you want to say, and the shape of your argument, and distill it. So that's a powerful thing. Certainly, Sally, you mentioned, Montaigne and reading, reading. I always find someone's always said it better. So, I think particularly of, and I'm not sure what Nicholas would think of this, reading Stanner on the dreaming. It seems in 50 years, no one's really sort of, to me, written quite as sort of powerfully or beautifully about that.
It's a very intimate thing, I think, to find a favourite essayist or essays that you just return to again and again and again. Simone Weil is somebody that I just do it with. I think I read her essay on friendship perhaps once a year, but every year. Such a lovely thing.
Do you still like your friends afterwards?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, more and more. I understand more why. I'm feeling sort of a little bit guilty in a way, funnily from something Gideon said, although Gideon would be the last writer that I could, would say, have as many words as you want. But there are some writers that you can say that to. They're just writers that are not going to then deliver sort of 14,000 words, and you'll have to, cancel half of the planned edition. It's a lovely thing to be, and there are versions of that sentence that you can say to writers like Gideon who do like to write long. It's such a pleasurable thing to not set a specific word length and just to be able to let them roam. Chloe and Gideon, particularly, this may be true of you too, Nicholas, but I know with Gideon and Chloe, because of monthly essays that have become books. Your book next week, The Racket, started as a sort of 5,000 word essay, and of course The Tall Man. When does an essay become a book for you particularly, I suppose, Gideon, because quite a few of them have...
It was actually 6,500 words that...
I don't know how I
you actually gave me 6,000 and I slipped another 500 in there and you didn't say anything about it. I can talk about it now.
Yeah.
She thought she was going to get 8,000, Gideon.
I did. I was really shocked. I was delighted. Yeah.
Well, ideally, the difference is... I mean, I always overwork my subjects, and I always follow the subject down every burrow that I can, and end up, dispensing with 90% of the material that I've accumulated. So in that sense, I've often got a fairly good idea of the hinterland of the story, even if I've only sort of concentrated on the centre. I think. It depends on whether you finish the essay and you feel as though you have something still to say, or there are still some things that puzzle you, there are still some things that you haven't quite worked out to your own satisfaction. And that often happens when you started off the story knowing nothing about the subject. And that was certainly the case with writing about abortion. It had never occurred to me that I would write anything about this subject, but I just so happened to be drawn into it and to want to work through it, sort of not just intellectually but psychologically as well. And that process was not complete at the end of the essay. I felt as though I had more to say and more to do.
Well, I knew that I wanted to write a book about this case from the day I arrived on the island. And Gideon, I'm not going to brag that I got to write 10,000 words, although I'd sent 12. So, perhaps I got cut further.
It's been an eternal bone of contention between me and Sally ever since, but that's okay.
This was something that got under my skin, and I couldn't let the story go, or it couldn't let me go, and here we are. But one question I'd be interested to ask Nicolas and Gideon and Sally is, how do you know that this is what you want to write an essay about? I mean, how does whether or not you pick the story or the story picks you, what it is that sort of gets under your skin, and how you recognise that this is something that you can expand, yourself, in.
Well, from a thought, I mean, as an editor, sometimes it's you have an idea and you go and find a writer that's willing to do it, and sometimes it's a writer that you can. I mean, the most lovely thing is to be able to say to a writer, "What would you like to write about?" Because it'll probably be their best work, something that's been forming. But Nicolas, this question would be more for you, since I'm not writing as I'm editing.
Well, maybe you should tell us a little bit about your criteria for judging essays.
I mean, a great essay when you read it. That when Chloe's tall man landed in the email, and I read it in an email, dusty little internet booth actually in Queensland, and you just know as soon as you read it. Same with Shoot the Messenger, and the same with Nicholas's essay Fragments and Dust, which is going to be in the next edition. You just know, you just read it, and you. It's probably easy to say why an essay is not publishable, where something's, the saddest thing, I suppose, is when something's just utterly predictable. That's the most disappointing thing. I can't remember which one of you spoke about it now, but I think might have been you, Nicolas, where you just think what the writer's going to think and say, and then they think and say it, and then particularly if they don't do it well, that's the best kind of essay is something unexpected. Often it's it's a writer doing something that you wouldn't think they could do. Kevin Rudd writing on Dietrich Bonhoeffer was unexpected and very, very well done. And so I suppose it's the quality of the ideas and the thought, and then and an elegance and a beauty. I mean, I think a great essay has something beautiful about it, even if it's dealing with something that's horrible or sad.
It's worth saying that for a writer, it's also a matter of knowing that a forum exists for you to go through your paces. A lot of the subjects that I've written about over the last 3 years, I wouldn't have given the faintest thought of writing about had the monthly not existed as a place, as a repository for them. Just to dilate somewhat on the piece I wrote about Neville Shute, I didn't know really that there was a piece there when I started. I just had a feeling that it was a subject I should know.
Tell us about that feeling, Gideon.
That feeling. Oh, well, okay, I'll tell you about that feeling. I was finishing off a book. I was finishing off another book, and I felt as though I needed a sort of a recreational intellectual interest. And I picked up a book in a second-hand shop called Voices Prophesying War by I.F. Clarke, an English academic. And it was a book about fictional future wars. And it had a couple of short passages about On the Beach, Neville Shute's novel written in 1957 about the end of the world. And I thought, yeah, that's interesting actually. I remember reading that as a kid, and some of the things that he said about the novel struck me as immediately interesting, that it was unique or virtually unique among novels of its kind in proposing that the human race had been entirely annihilated. There was no escape. Most nuclear Holocaust novels posited at least some small group of survivors, and the fact that it was in its time, it was very much the first of its kind, and it achieved prodigious critical and commercial success. And of course, it was written in Melbourne, written on the Mornington Peninsula, in fact, and set on the Mornington Peninsula. And as I discovered, it was that it went straight to the top of the American bestseller list. It was a book perfectly in tune with the zeitgeist.
You know, one of the things you just made me realise, Gideon, is about a really great essay is one where you think you're not interested in the topic.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's the key, isn't it? You know, you just think, why would I mean, you know, I can understand, obviously, you know, Neville Shute some of his work, but, you know, he was not somebody I'd ever really was interested in, but in reading about him, I mean, and, you know, the New Yorker just comes immediately to mind with their, you know, that they can, you know, whether it's a guy stuck in an elevator for 41 hours and you're going to hear the whole history of the elevator over 12,000 words and you can't put it down, or, I mean, it's the most recent one that just, it takes you in, it takes you on a track that you just didn't expect to be interested in. It'll keep bringing you back, it'll tell you a story. I mean, I suppose that's the most important, it's what I want more, I want everyone to be able to do, is to tell a great story. So it doesn't matter what it's about, I'm just going to be compelled to read.
Well, in the case of Shute, I took a nice long run-up to this piece. I started ordering Neville Shute novels on Abe Books, and I gradually acquired a very large library of Neville Shute books.
He wrote as many books as Gideon has written.
But some of them very good, and I sort of read them over the course of the next couple of months, and then I decided to tell Sally about it as a story idea to see if she was interested. So God knows if she hadn't been interested, I would have ended up with 23 Neville Shute novels on my bookshelves. Not bad at all, but you need to be choosy.
Nicolas, what about you? What makes a great essay for you?
Well, I was listening to you just then with, I must say, mounting skepticism. I think we want to be careful not to fetishize the essay about really unimportant things. You know? I'm actually interested in things that seem to me to matter and that open up the key to what's hiding behind reality. And you know, I don't know, I'm that much interested in what happens to the essay afterwards. But I do think that the form allows you to play different things off. You know, you can play off ideas, you can play off structure, it can refer to itself. That's where it becomes an interesting form for me. I think of it as having some sort of analogies with musical form. and with the maintenance of tension and the jumping between major and minor key and the resolution. Or non-resolution, as the case may be. And I'm sure that it's those properties and formal qualities I'm responding to in an essay. But I'm not sure I really want to read long essays about being stuck in elevators or whatever.
Yeah, not necessarily unimportant things. I think I said things that you didn't think you were interested in.
No, look, that's a fair correction. But I guess, I have this terrible sense that, time is short and we want to grapple with the really big deal out there, the total mystery of life and its impenetrability and elusiveness.
I think you should send Gideon now to do a piece on being stuck in an elevator.
I could amuse myself, surprisingly.
I mean, important things can also, of course, be there where you think they may not be. What about humour, Gideon? You mentioned that as something, that we're rather earnest in Australia, and I would tend to agree, actually. It's difficult to find, and yet we've got a lot of funny people and a lot of writers. Why it's difficult to find a humorous, longer essay.
Well, I think the problem is that people divide the world into the funny writers and the serious writers, which is foolish and counterproductive. And I think part of that's to do with the kind of the construction of newspapers and periodicals on very mechanical lines. There's a space over here, it needs a funny piece, get the funny guy to do that. Here we need some good old-fashioned stodge and fibre to fill. Let's put a Michelle Grattan story here. And it's an arbitrary and a counterproductive distinction. And I quoted Chesterton before, and Chesterton is an example of a wonderfully funny, serious writer. He's a writer that I go back to again and again to read, a collection like Orthodoxy or like Heretics. His ability within 5 or 6 paragraphs to seem to turn the world on its head and to delight and disorient you with his sort of paradoxes and whimsicalities. That's a lightness of touch that you just encounter very, very seldom in serious, ostensibly serious political writing these days. I think there's a tendency to just mistake sarcasm for wit, and cynicism for insight. Chesterton was just a wonderfully delightful, engaged, amusing writer who was in love not only with his subjects but with the writing process.
Just 1 second, I just want to ask, when you started in journalism, were the kind of pieces that you were able to write in newspapers then longer? Were they closer to essay length, so that you have to look outside of newspapers now in order to write long?
I don't know about that, but look, I think the issue of length and the form, the amount of words that you have in a particular medium is absolutely critical. I mean, this is something which is going to dominate the future of our working lives. How much you can write, in what sort of manner, what mix of levity and seriousness. Everything you just said, Gideon, was spot on the money. This ghastly over-seriousness and over-grown-upness of writing about politics, for God's sake. Which is, on the whole, a subject which is fit for humour. There has been a change in the length of newspaper formats, and there's also been a change in the relationship between word and image, which is very important. All of these things require much more sort of, examination than we can give them in the next few minutes. But I do think that we're dealing with an old medium, the newspaper, which is really creaking along, and it is now run in formulaic fashion on a kind of fantasy of what people are imagined to wish to receive. And the kinds of human beings who are lifted up to the higher levels of the hierarchy of this industry, doubtless as in any other industry, are often unsatisfactory.
Is there a sort of an essay that each of you would just kind of dream to write, that's sort of sitting there, you know, that you'd love to write if you had the time and the space? And I'm probably asking for a pitch on stage here, I think.
Well, maybe Gideon could contribute an essay on being stuck in an elevator with an MUP book on rage.
Or a newspaper. Chloe, is it a form you'd like to do more of? I mean, you're working on a novel now. You've just finished a non-fiction book. You're now back to a novel. You know, is the essay a form that's sort of going to feature in your future landscape?
Oh, I'd love it to, and I'm not really an old hand at this. I mean, the first essay I wrote was on the young liberals, and so I think that was kind of a funny piece of political writing in some ways. I guess, though, I asked before the other essayists, that feeling of finding a story for me is a very exciting one, when you do sort of feel that there's a golden strand that you can follow, and that it will lead you somewhere that you hadn't expected to be, and that you also find something that you're prepared to be obsessed over, like Neville Shute. That's a tremendous, enriching and sort of fabulous state to find yourself in, and you can get out in sort of 6,000 words perhaps. So I hope for more, but yeah, I'll get stuck in an elevator.
Can I ask whether your induction as a kind of an essay writer has informed your writing as a novelist? Would you have written the same sort of novel now that you're writing if you'd done it 2 years ago, sort of pre The Tall Man?
I think I would have, because this novel was pretty advanced, and then I put it aside to work on the non-fiction book. I do think that having the skills of a novelist are incredibly helpful in terms of writing essays, because you are thinking about the structure of a story and what the story is and how to tell it and how to, take people along with you in any way you can.
Yeah, it's interesting how many that, you know, really fine essayists in Australia don't come from journalism. I mean, obviously some of them do.
I should also say, actually, that being able to go out into the world and take things back into the cave with you, Nicholas, as you mentioned before, is incredibly helpful as a novelist too. So.
I beg your pardon?
Saying the interesting question is whether or not there are any journalists who can write good essays, or whether journalism actually militates against the writing of the essay because it's a closed form.
I think it does. I mean, it's a problem finding journalists in Australia who can do it, and it's partly why I asked about that sort of thing between the column and the book, because it's journalists who write so many books. A lot of them shouldn't be written too. I mean, I think that, you know, a lot of books would be better as essays. Yeah, I think there is some problem with journalism in what you spoke about right at the start, Nicholas, about just being free and open, and really connecting with something within yourself to be able to do that. And perhaps journalism teaches something much more outward, which makes that difficult. I don't know. Gideon, what do you think?
Well, I mean, we could sit here and lambaste journalists all night, and I'd be leading the charge. But one thing
it's not what I'm doing.
It has struck me
you should do on scorn.
One group of people that seems to have withdrawn entirely from the writing of essays is academics. You know, we had a tradition of intellectuals who engaged in public life and wrote on major public issues. Where are they? Where are they now? Certainly, if they, the clock-watching university administrator looking over this individual's shoulder will not be condoning him writing an essay. But I think there's a lack of a desire for academics to raise their head above the parapet and write in that thinking aloud fashion that I was talking before, because academics these days are sort of trained to cordon off an area, a specialty area, and fortify it against challenge. Writing an essay is kind of is more.
It's the opposite in a way.
It's the opposite. It's
I
kind
think
of.
That's really true.
Yeah, it's communicative. It's open-ended. It invites challenge. It invites, and it's ultimately a pretty speculative form. I wonder whether academics are actually up to the task of writing that way anymore.
It seems such a sad note to end, such a joyful topic, but we're going to have to because somebody's just flashed lights in our eyes. Look, we don't need to worry because we've got just incredible people like Nicolas Rothwell and Gideon Haigh and Chloe Hooper, so that we're never going to be short of this wonderful form, at least for now. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you again to these three great writers.
And thank you to Sally.